All right, let's jump into another deep dive. You sent over some really interesting articles about US-Japan relations, and wow, I gotta say, there's a lot to unpack here. Like, we're seeing Japan make some pretty significant moves, especially when it comes to their economic ties with the US.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time to be watching these two. It's not like they're just drifting apart.
Yeah.
But it's more like Japan's stepping into a more independent role, figuring things out on their own terms. And one thing that really caught my eye is this trend of them selling off their U.S. Treasury bond holdings.
Yeah, that's a big one. And the numbers are pretty striking. Back in 2020, they had like almost $1.3 trillion in those bonds. But now it's down to about a trillion. I mean, that's a huge drop, especially when you think about how they used to be the biggest foreign holder of U.S. debt. So what's the deal? Are they just looking for better returns somewhere else?
I think it's a bit more strategic than that. You see, for a long time, Japan had this thing called ultra-loose monetary policy, right?
Ah.
Basically, they kept interest rates super low.
Mm-hmm.
And that made U.S. Treasury bonds pretty attractive because they offered better returns compared to their own government bonds back then. But now, things are changing. Japan's moving away from that policy, and their own bonds are starting to look more appealing.
So it's like they're looking inward, trying to make themselves stronger financially.
Exactly.
But there's more to it than that, right? Like, what about all the ups and downs in the currency markets? How does that play into this?
Oh, absolutely. The yen has been weakening against the dollar,
Right.
and that's pushed Japan to step in and, take action.
Right.
They're selling off those U.S. Treasury bonds to buy up more dollars, which helps stabilize their own currency.
It's like a balancing act,
Yeah, exactly.
using those bonds to keep things steady when the yen starts to wobble. But it also seems like Japan's thinking long term here, like they're diversifying their portfolio,
Right.
not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly. I think they're starting to realize that relying too heavily on the U.S. might not be the best strategy anymore. So now they're exploring other options like Europe and Asia.
And what kinds of things are they looking at in those markets?
Well, they're getting involved in things like infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia and even renewable energy companies in Europe.
Mm.
It's all about spreading the risk and, maybe finding some better returns along the way.
So for the U.S., this means less demand for their debt, which could push their borrowing costs up, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
But could this diversification actually be good for the U.S. in some ways, or even for the global economy as a whole?
It's possible. I mean, a more diversified global economy could actually be more stable in the long run.
Right.
And as for the U.S., it might give them a little nudge, to find ways to make their debt more attractive to investors.
It's kind of like Japan's move is creating these ripples that could reshape the whole financial landscape.
Yeah.
And speaking of reshaping things, let's shift gears and talk about that attempted acquisition that made headlines a while back. Japan's Nippon Steel, they wanted to buy U.S. Steel, and they even promised to keep jobs in the headquarters right there in Pittsburgh.
Right, right. That was a big move by Nippon Steel. They saw it as a chance to create this global steel powerhouse, combining their know-how with U.S. Steel's, their presence here.
But then the Biden administration stepped in and blocked the whole thing. They cited national security concerns. What were they worried about exactly?
Basically, they didn't want to lose control over a crucial industry like steel. We're seeing this trend where governments are starting to prioritize national security when it comes to foreign investment, especially in those sectors that are vital for the economy or for defense, really.
So it's not just about the money anymore, it's about who's calling the shots in these key industries.
Exactly.
And it seems like this decision really stirred things up, not just with this particular case, but for U.S.-Japan relations overall. I mean, didn't Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel end up suing the Biden administration over
They
this?
did, yeah.
And even the Japanese government wasn't happy about it. They saw it as like a warning sign, like maybe the U.S. isn't so open to Japanese investments anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. This whole situation really highlights that tension between, working together economically and keeping things secure on the national level.
And for Japan, it seems like it's pushing them further down this path of doing their own thing, being more independent.
Definitely.
It's like this blocked acquisition just added fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
But there's another layer to this, right? What about the possibility of Trump coming back? How does that fit into all of this?
Oh, yeah. That adds a whole other level of, uncertainty, to put it mildly. From what we saw during his first term, he was pretty vocal about his issues with Japan's trade practices. And he's always been a big proponent of protectionism, putting America first and all that.
Right. So it makes you wonder what would happen to U.S.-Japan relations if he gets another 4 years. Could we see those trade tensions flare up again? And what about disagreements on defense spending? How much Japan contributes? Could we see more friction there too?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. A Trump administration might take a much harder stance, which could definitely lead to, well, more clashes in those areas. But what's really interesting is that Japan's not just sitting around waiting to see what happens. They're actively trying to build stronger relationships with other key players, almost like they're creating a more diverse network of allies, just in case.
It's like they're taking control of their own destiny. They're not just reacting to the U.S. anymore.
Exactly.
And one of the most fascinating parts of this whole thing is how Japan's relationship with China is changing.
Oh, yeah. That's a tricky one, to say the least. They've got a long history together, full of both cooperation and conflict. But it seems like Japan's taking a very practical approach.
How so?
Well, they recognize how important China is economically,
Yay.
but they're also being cautious because of the potential security risks.
So it's a real balancing act.
It is.
Trying to boost those economic ties while also keeping an eye on those security concerns. And that's where those new partnerships with countries like India and Australia come in, right?
Exactly. By strengthening those relationships, Japan's creating a kind of counterbalance to China's growing power in the region. And they're all part of that, the Quad, right? The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue
Right. Good
with
point.
the U.S., India, and Australia. And they're also doing joint military exercises with these countries.
So it's not just about diversifying their investments, it's about their security alliances too. Like they're building this multi-layered safety net. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture, the history of all this.
Yeah, good point.
You mentioned earlier that to really understand what's happening now, we need to rewind a bit.
Exactly. Because, the U.S.-Japan relationship didn't exactly start out on the best of terms. Remember Commodore Matthew Perry? He sailed into Japan in 1853 with like a whole fleet of American warships, basically forcing them to open up to the West after centuries of isolation.
Wow. That must have been a huge turning point for Japan, being thrown onto the world stage like that.
It was. But it also kicked off this period of rapid modernization and industrial growth. It was like they were playing catch-up at warp speed.
So the U.S. inadvertently helped Japan become a global power.
In a way, yeah. But as Japan got stronger, the tensions with the U.S. started to rise, which eventually led to World War II.
And then after the war, the U.S. occupied Japan, reshaping their government and their economy.
Right.
I mean, that's the foundation for the alliance we see today, but you can still see how those early encounters continue to influence things.
Absolutely. The past is never really past, is it?
Yeah.
And even though they've become partners, there's still that underlying tension, especially when it comes to competing economically.
Yeah, like in the 80s and 90s with those trade wars over cars and electronics.
Exactly.
So this move toward diversification isn't totally out of the blue. It's part of a bigger pattern of Japan trying to assert its economic independence.
Exactly. And with all the uncertainty surrounding U.S. policy, especially with the possibility of a second Trump term, they're taking steps to protect themselves. It's not just about reacting, it's about taking charge of their future.
It's really strategic. I mean, they're strengthening ties with all sorts of partners, India, Australia, even countries in the European Union. And those trade agreements like that Trans-Pacific Partnership or CPTPP, those give them more options, They're not so reliant on the U.S.-led system anymore.
It's all about having choices and reducing their dependence on any one partner, which is pretty smart in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar, more and more power centers emerging.
It's a lot to process. We've gone from Japan selling off U.S. Treasury bonds to that blocked acquisition, and now we're seeing how all of this fits into the bigger picture of U.S.-Japan relations. It's complicated, but one thing's for sure, Japan is definitely stepping onto the world stage in a whole new way. Yeah, it's a real turning point. But there's another side to all this, right? Like, how are people in Japan feeling about all these changes? Are they on board with Japan taking a more independent approach on the world stage?
That's a great question. And, Japanese public opinion, it's not so simple. It's kind of like their foreign policy. There are a lot of layers to it. But I'd say there's definitely a sense of national pride growing, this feeling that Japan should be playing a bigger role in global affairs,
Yeah, I can see that. But I also wonder if there's some anxiety mixed in with that pride, right? Japan's history is unique, and I'm sure there are concerns about potential conflicts, especially with China.
Oh, absolutely. The legacy of past conflicts, especially World War II, I mean, that's a heavy weight. But there's also this growing awareness that cooperation is crucial, not just for economic growth, but for stability in the region, too.
So it's like they're trying to balance asserting themselves with maintaining peace.
Yeah, kind of like walking a tightrope.
Exactly. And it's not just about China, right? They're balancing this with all their partners, including the U.S. I mean, we talked about how some Japanese investors are moving away from U.S. Treasury bonds.
Right.
I mean, that's not just an economic strategy, it's a statement.
Absolutely. It's like they're saying, hey, we're not just going to follow your lead anymore. We're going to do what's best for Japan.
Make their own decision.
Yeah. And a lot of people in Japan, they get that. They're looking inward, focusing on strengthening their own society, their economy. There's this sense of self-reliance building. They believe Japan can carve out its own path.
It's like a coming-of-age story for a whole
I
nation.
like that.
After all those years aligned with the U.S., Japan's stepping out on its own, finding its own way.
And that's what makes this such a fascinating time. We're seeing Japan take risks, make big moves, and really stand up for themselves on the world stage. It's a reminder that things are always changing, and countries adapt in ways you might not expect.
So where does this leave U.S.-Japan relations? Are we seeing a split, or can they make this new reality work?
It's hard to say for sure. There are definitely challenges ahead, but they have this strong foundation of shared values, common interests. That's important.
It sounds like the key is going to be open communication, really trying to understand each other.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the heart of it all. This isn't just about governments and policies. It's about people. It's about the Japanese people figuring out their place in the world. And it's about us understanding and respecting that.
This deep dive has been incredible. It's clear that the U.S.-Japan relationship is entering a whole new chapter, a chapter with lots of potential, but also some bumps in the road.
For sure. And it's a chapter that's still being written. So, keep watching Japan. What they do, the choices they make, their goals, it's all going to have an impact way beyond their borders. It'll shape the balance of power in Asia and influence what happens globally for years to come.
That's a great point. Thanks for walking us through all this. And for our listeners, I hope this deep dive has given you a new way of looking at Japan's role in the world. Keep learning, keep asking questions. There's always more to discover.